from Caixin Media, based in China, Beijing. I'm honored to be here and moderate this panel, Global Capital, the specific characters of Asian market. Speaking of Asian market, it's huge, it's emerging, and its potential. At capital markets, the professional investors and organizations such as PE, VC, and angels has been booming recently in China and in other countries in Asia. So there's so much money in markets wondering to invest in what, where, and when. And now we have these speakers and we have some experts in the audience. They will share with us their experiences and thoughts today just at this panel. All these speakers and experts are very experienced persons in Asia and in capital markets. I think it's a very good opportunity to know better Asian market, to know better the capital market in Asia. So now let me introduce our speakers at first. And let me introduce you, our speaker, key speaker, Deputy Minister for Development of the Far East, Mr. Maxim Shereykin. Please.
Спасибо за предоставленное слово.
Thank you for giving me the floor. I wanted to be the last one to speak because I was afraid that I will initiate a slightly different tone. From the point of view of Asian capital, we are interested in a very narrow niche where we operate as officials of governmental agencies. These are direct foreign investments, $1.5 trillion circulating in this market, and this is an FDI market. Greenfield investments, that's migration of enterprises all over the world, and merger and acquisition market, and over 50% of this investment flow is circulating in Asia-Pacific area. A percentage of 2013 year come from Southeast Asia and Eastern Asia. And this is a priority market for us because we, as the Minister of Far East Development, are responsible for tapping investment to be used in the Far East of Russia. We often asked why foreign investments you're focusing on. Again, you're beginning to sell out our homeland. Before that, I used to work in Kaluga Oblast, and annually the inflow on foreign investment was over $1 billion. And our governor was blamed for selling out the homeland. But when a new minister came to be in charge of our ministry, he said that our focus from now on will be tapping direct foreign investments. And those foreign investments which used to come to Russia, 99% of them, 90% of them were invested in localization projects. Why we decided to be focused on foreign investments? Because our products to be produced in the Far East are not welcome in Korea or in China. So we decided to use the tactics that we need to attract foreign investors, their products, and we want them to localize part of their technological processes, added value projects. Most of these investments are interested in the commodities market. It is more or less divided between major players, and we're not going to be a major player in this way, but we want to establish a favorable environment for those investors. Russia adopted a new law for the priority development regions. It's a new law. It is based on major priority investment projects to attract. And the major product for those areas of development is a velocity and risk minimization for the investments. That's why I'm more or less interested in foreign direct investments. We have a target audience, about 4,500 major investing companies. They're mostly engaged in the South Pacific area, moving their capital among the countries, and we want to focus to be competitive, trying to tap part of those investment flows to the Russian Far East. That doesn't include to invite Russian capital. We are mostly interested in merger and acquisition model. This is a B2B project. We could speak at such forums, attracting foreign capital. But our key priority is greenfield projects. And to implement such projects, we do everything in our power to provide enabling environment for foreign investments in the Far East and to share a bit of this pie in the Far East. Thank you.
Introduce the new development in the Far East of Russia. And you are interested in the foreign investors, and many of them now sitting beside with you. So then you can ask many questions for them. Okay, the speakers will introduce themselves very briefly. Let me introduce you the first, Mr. Sebastien Cochard. He's a Frenchman, now based in Moscow. Please introduce yourself, your job, and your school.
Thank you, madam. Indeed, I'm French.
Я гражданин Франции, работаю в рамках российского правительства. Я несколько лет провел на Дальнем Востоке, Юго-Восточной Азии, представляю интересы Всемирного банка. Возможно, мы поговорим о том, насколько существует разница в цели положения развития и движения капиталов. Спасибо. Следующий у нас господин доктор Ган Лу, основатель и генеральный директор Technode.
To be here. I think I come from very different backgrounds because I started my own blog like eight years ago when I was in UK. So it was my personal blog. Then around 2011, I turned my hobby into a kind of media business. So now I run Techno, which is a tech blog. We cover Chinese technology and also startup news every day. We also have English version and also French version. We also now partner with TechCrunch, the world leading tech media. So we also manage TechCrunch China business. Now, we are talking to startups in China almost every day. We also run incubator in Beijing. Now we have 6,000 meters square incubator in Shanghai is on building now. So I think my experience, because we travel a lot in Asia. I was in India 2 weeks ago and was in Israel last year, so also Korea. So I think if we talk about the venture capital in Asia, it's really broad topic because if you look into the startup ecosystem in Asia, in every country, each country in Asia, I think environment is really different. In China, now it's everything. There's lots of money there, lots of startups, but in India, it's really what I would say is like 5 years behind the Chinese startup ecosystems because lots of things there is really new. But Japan, Taiwan, so everybody, every country have different characteristics. So.
We also have speakers from Singapore or in Taiwan. We'll discuss later. And now let me introduce you Mr. Igor Kapovich. I have to say he's a very experienced banker. Please.
Thank you for the compliment. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me to be on the panel here. Indeed, I'm based in Moscow. For the past 2 years with Sberbank, which is the largest bank in Russia, and I lead our venture banking business, to promote venture financing and venture-backed companies. But prior to that, I spent more than 15 years in New York working for such global companies as G Capital and Citigroup with global responsibilities. I did spend a lot of time in Asia, in Taiwan, in Japan, in Korea, in China, and we view those as very dynamic, high-growth markets, and we'll be very happy to talk about that during the panel. Thank you.
Thank you. So, talk later. And Mr. Fabian Wang, who's from Ernst Young and now based in London, please.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? I know it's not really perfect sound system here, but okay? All right. My name is Fabian Wong. I'm based in London. I sit in EY's global markets team. So EY, several months ago, we were called Ernst & Young. Now it's a shorter form. It's called EY. EY is a global professional services firm that spans more than 170 odd countries. We have more than 190,000 professional services staff cast across the globe. And my role focuses a lot on the Asian markets. So the markets that I cover would be Korea, Japan, China, ASEAN, and Oceania. And these markets that I cover are very actively doing a lot of bilateral trade with global geographies. And my role is very simple, is to really act as the catalyst to make these kind of activities more vibrant, if that's the right word, between companies that want to go overseas and companies from the overseas that wants to come to Asia. So that's me, Global Markets, Fabian Wong. Nice to meet you guys.
Thank you, Fabi. And the last one but not least, Mr. Francis Yuan, who's a professor at University of Singapore.
Right, good afternoon. My name is Francis. My affiliation now is as a professorial fellow for entrepreneurship at the National University of Singapore. But prior to that, I spent a large part of 30 years or so in different roles, all with a common theme that is relating to research, R&D, innovation, entrepreneurship, and startups. So my most recent stint of work before I sort of retired, semi-retired into academia, is to run the Singapore National Research Foundation, which is a foundation set up in the Prime Minister's office to promote research, innovation, and enterprise. I will talk a bit about that later on. Do I talk about it now or?
Yes.
I do. Okay.
Shall we introduce our experts in the audience? Mr. Dmitry
Okay.
Fadaliv. He's an entrepreneur and a legal advisor, and he will join our discussion later. Hi, Mr. Fadaliv. And Mr. Anton Gopka. He's the CEO and the general partner at ATEM, and he also used to manage Russian-based VC funds. So he's very experienced in this area. So.
Okay, I'll start. Yeah.
Start from your presentation.
Okay, sure. Thank you. So I have the honor of starting first. So I was just talking a bit about my experience. So a number of things. Most recently, as the National Research Foundation, which I'll also talk a little bit about it. This is set up to push research, innovation, enterprise. Before that, I was running a startup internet company for a few years. So my career sort of goes between public, government policy setting, and private, and also research. So I was also director of an Information Technology Institute, which is a research institute in IT, that was doing a lot of interesting things before or just about the time of the internet explosion. So the institute also spun out quite a few companies with venture financing. Okay, so this is me. Let me, well, I can skip this unless you don't know where Singapore is. But since this is an international platform, maybe I ought to not assume that everybody knows where Singapore is, right? So if this is the world map, for a map like this, you probably need a magnifying glass to see where Singapore is. Right? It's a little tiny speck just where the arrowhead is pointing. Okay, I'll skip some of this. Now, Singapore developed quite dramatically, I guess, over the last 50 years from a very primitive village to a global city. And over that period of about 50 years, it has gone through a number of transitions from originally just labor intensive, just getting jobs for people, and increasingly as the economy progresses, it moves up to the value chain. Until now, Singapore is talking a lot about technology intensive, innovation intensive, knowledge intensive kinds of industries, right? This chart shows the growth in GDP over that period, which is actually quite a lot. And I lived through that period of growth, and I can actually see the sort of impact that happened. Now, as far as funding for innovation, the topic of our panel, funding for innovation and startups, I think that only came into being quite late. So during the period of the 90s, I suppose, when the industry becomes to be more technology intensive, where there's more investments in R&D and more interest in entrepreneurship as well as startup ventures. So around the 1990s onwards until now, right? So the panel wants to discuss about what are the factors affecting private investments and the difference between Asian. Now, I'm not in private equity. I'm not an expert in that. I'll leave it to the other panelists. But I think compared to the West, Asian investors, especially the private investors, people with extra money, are less motivated to invest in venture capital. So that's been the case for a long time because early stage startups are risky, the perceived high risk. It is much better to invest in real estate. And of course, places like Singapore and Hong Kong are known to invest a lot of money in real estate, both locally within their countries as well as internationally. In fact, I read that in 2012, Singapore investors, Singapore is a tiny country, was responsible for more than a quarter of London's real estate purchases in value. So that's quite amazing for a small country to do that. So that tells you about the sort of love affair Singapore investors has with real estate. So a lot of VCs operate out of Singapore. I mean, they have the headquarters in Singapore, so the amount of funds under management goes into the billions. But a lot of this is invested outside of Singapore because, again, of the perceived risk. Until recently. What happened recently, in the past 3 or 4 years, a lot more venture money comes into Singapore, and I think a lot of this has to do with certain government initiatives, which I'll explain a little bit later. The government initiatives, Singapore has always wanted to develop an entrepreneurial economy, right? Because in the past, a lot of the economy actually comes from multinationals putting investments in the country and building capital-intensive plants, factories, and offering jobs. But Singapore wants to move into a more entrepreneurial economy, which is driven by high-tech startups, for instance. So the first major effort was around 1999. This was when there was a plan called Technopreneurship 21, where the government actually put aside $1 billion. At that time, the exchange rate was $1.7 Singapore dollars to the US. So it's $1 billion to push high-tech entrepreneurship and stimulate the venture capital industry. So this this had some success, so the government agency actually became limited partners of funds all over the world, in the US, Europe, in Israel. And also there was money to push startups. So a lot of activity came about. And then this was, those of you who remember, right, this was 1999. So this was in the heat of the dot-com boom, and even a Singapore company which came out of the institute that I was managing then actually made it to the front page of Fortune magazine. So it was quite amazing then. Unfortunately, this was short-lived because then the dot-com bubble burst, followed by 9/11, followed by a recession. So venture capital was dead all over the world, including in Singapore. But Singapore continues to have this ambition to become a hub for entrepreneurs, to make the nation one of the easiest to do business, to be attractive to entrepreneurs and startup companies. So the second major effort came about when the National Research Foundation was set up in 2006. And I was fortunate enough to be involved in the setup of this office, where again the government committed quite a large sum of money for Singapore, $4 billion to develop research, innovation, and enterprise. So the National Research Foundation was primarily involved in funding research at the universities, deep science and technology. But also there was a plan to develop an R&D-based innovation and enterprise ecosystem, which would involve the universities, the centers of knowledge, where IP is created, and to look at what is missing, for this science from the university to turn into innovations, to end up to be used in industry. And of course, to also have the supporting infrastructure of government regulations and so on around it, venture industry, right? So what has happened? Among the initiatives that was put up was something called a National Framework for Innovation Enterprise, which essentially later on translates into a series of programs to stimulate private money to invest in startups. So at the end, we have some funding for universities to develop the innovation capacity, but also along the way for the ideation stage of companies, for seed stage, for early stage, there are different programs that are set up to stimulate private venture capital industry. For example, the technology so for example, the early stage venture funds was one-to-one matching, right? Government puts in $10 million, the private investor puts in $10 million, and the fund is used to invest in early stage startups. So these are some of the venture companies that took advantage of this to invest in early stage. Also, before it reaches Series A, the funding at the seed stage, up to about $500,000, again, the government was willing to co-invest 85% of equity in a startup, as long as the private money, the incubators, invest the other 15%. Okay, and there are also other entities that were doing grant financing. Okay, so what the long and short of this is, after a few years of all this effort, in Singapore now we have quite a good, healthy ecosystem where there's enough seed stage people who will be who are investing in startups and providing guidance to them, early stage venture capitalists, including those that are seeded by the government, but also those that are not. Those are the purely private company, right? And also, of course, a lot of accelerators, events, and so on. So if you look at especially seed and early stage startup companies in Singapore, there's now really quite a comprehensive range of different investment instruments that are available for each stage, right from the initiation of the idea, where you need something like 50,000, right up to early stage growth. And beyond, of course, there's private money. Okay, and some of these is borne out by data that comes out. For example, this was an economist report that looks at number of internet companies per 1 million population. And as you can see, Singapore actually, although it's a small country, but if you normalize by the population, it actually creates quite a lot of internet companies. Okay, as well as other news about how Singapore is doing. Okay. Okay, so in conclusion, I think that the government has a role to play if it wants to stimulate private money, especially in the early stage and incubated level investments, because that's the stage where private money is most scarce because of the high risk involved. And if you do that, and if you plan the incentives well, this could generate a virtuous cycle, and eventually the government can withdraw and let the private industry take over. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Young. It's a well-prepared presentation, has many interesting contents. Let me bring a question to Mr. Cochard about the cultural factors. You are French in Russia, so can you share your experience about, do you really think the cultural factor has an impact, big impact on private investment?
I would want first to reassure Professor Yeho that we all know where Singapore is, and we all love Singapore. I even was living 2 years in Hong Kong and was craving for spending as much time as I could in Singapore, and envying my colleagues based there. Cultural factor is major in Asia, especially. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, there is in finance a total underdevelopment of cross-border finance compared to the aspects of let's call it the global value chain in Asia for production of real goods. Nowadays, for instance, China is not like the place where products are put together from the beginning to the end. And China is most of the time the end of the chain, and you have inputs coming from Southeast Asia, from Thailand, from Malaysia, and at the end the product is finalized in China and exported. The region for the production of global goods is deeply integrated for the, again, real economy. Finance compared to the development of real economy in Asia, according to the Asian Development Bank, the development of finance compared to the development of real economy is in a ratio of 7 on 100. Basically, the finance, because of cultural factors, which are most of the time actually political factors, is totally underdeveloped in Asia Pacific. And I totally concur with Professor Yeo to say that this is a task of governments indeed to tackle the issue, because private sector forces will not make it by themselves. As I mentioned in my brief introduction, I was working for a global bank based in Asia Pacific and working actually directly with governments in trying to alleviate the, let's call it, barriers to cross-border finance in Asia. And the task cannot be bottom-up. It cannot come from private sector participants to propose solutions. In Asia Pacific, it has to come top-down by the government sitting together and deciding on common schemes. So I was, for instance, advising the so-called ASEAN +3 bond market forum, which is one of the part of the ASEAN +3 government meetings, which is dedicated to finance. ASEAN +3 is the countries of the ASEAN plus China, Korea, and Japan. And this specific ASEAN +3 bond market forum, so-called ABMF, was actually developed under the lead and the financing actually of the Japanese government, which was trying to make that when actually the reservoir of domestic investors, Japanese investors buying the Japanese government bonds will be exhausted, when actually the capacity of buying government bonds by Japanese domestic investors will have reached its limit, the Japanese government bonds could be bought not by European investors or US investors, but by Chinese, Singaporean, Malaysian, Indonesian investors. And currently in Asia Pacific, these tubes for cross-border finance between Asian countries do not exist. You have these tubes very well existing custodian banks and wholesale global banks had created these tubes, these links between US and each individual Asian countries, or between European countries and European investors and each Asian country, but it's extremely difficult for a Malaysian investor to buy some Chinese financial products, or for Korean investors to buy some Indonesian financial products. And these solutions, instead of creating these tubes for cross-border finance in Asia, will definitely come through the government. And in this, of course, cultural factors are extremely important. I would just want to perhaps, it will be, I think probably some panelists will react on this, but Asia has an over-specificity for the future development of the region, for the future financial development of the region and the development of financing of startup and innovative companies. Asia has a very not well-known specificity of actually having a huge financing gap for innovating companies. Asia Pacific is in the area of the world where you have the highest percentage. It's the case, for instance, in China. 99% of companies in China are small and medium enterprises. But the average is quite important for the region as a whole. And the World Bank estimates that the gap of financing, the needs of finance which are not fulfilled by any mean, for the small and medium enterprises, and especially the innovative ones in Asia Pacific, represent 60% of the total lack of funding gap in the world. So Asia Pacific specifically need to find new ways of funding for small, medium, innovative companies. Another thing is that there is an advantage in Asia Pacific funding, which is that the region has a much more resilient banking system than European and US ones, and it is an heritage from the Asian crisis of the late 90s. Basically, the cost of capital due to the implementation of Basel III regulations will increase only by 2 to 5% in Asia Pacific, while it is estimated it will increase the cost of capital in the US by something like 25%, and the cost of capital in the European Union by 45%. So Asian banks have a strong advantage on this. And you want to take back the floor.
Yeah, I think the issue is quite specific, especially about the cultural parts. And Mr. Cochard had worked in Asia for more than 1 decade, right? You have your different experience, or you totally agree with Mr. Cochard or Professor Yu?
Well, I would agree with Dr. Yu, for example, that the role of the government is very important to set the parameters, but what's going to drive the development and the growth is the private sector. People talk about Silicon Valley as the model. I think Silicon Valley is unique, but it doesn't mean that you cannot replicate some of the components, and certainly helping create the ecosystem that enables entrepreneurs to become successful. In our business, we work with all the major venture capital funds, for example, both domestic and international, and we see that success breeds success. People come to the Silicon Valley from different parts of the world, including Asia. They start companies. The ecosystem allows them to prosper, to raise capital, to take companies public, to sell companies, and then that starts to flow back into the economy both domestically, but more importantly, back to where they came from. And so, so we see sort of this proliferation of companies, and entrepreneurs share success, they share experience, they share capital, and that allows other entrepreneurs to become more successful. So from that standpoint, I think it's extremely important to create the ecosystem and to allow the entrepreneurs to become successful and to prosper. Also, we see from some of the clients that work here in Russia, for example, right? They are looking at Asia right now, but not in any part of the. But what they're trying to do is find expertise or find where they have presence in order to start companies. So usually it's tied to a business they already acquired or to some other expertise, because otherwise it's very difficult to enter the market. And thirdly, the third observation is that the funds are becoming global. So the venture capital industry is very mature now. It moves around the world looking for opportunities, and certainly there's a fair amount of capital that's been created in developed markets, and it starts to flow back to the Asian markets.
It's of course capital markets. It's not only one or two factors to impact. It's ecosystem, of course. So the government plays a very important role in the ecosystem. And in the end of the presentation by Professor Yang, also mentioned the role of government. So I would like to ask Mr. Shereykin, what do you think about the government's role? How do you to establish a better or vibrant environment for startups? What's your policy?
Innovation is actually investments per se. You could invest into greenfield, pushing forward these technologies, or you could sell these technologies. So the Russian Federation primarily has all the formal development institutions. We're hearing about various promotion foundations in Singapore and other countries, and similar structures, similar systems are in existence in Russia. Unfortunately, a common weak point is that it is not always where we could attain the same results as in Singapore, for example. And what I think is that the Singapore experience in the context of Russia is not that applicable, though we could see familiar elements of Singapore experience. For example, a Kaluga Oblast or the Far Eastern experience of ours. We're coming back to the 90s, the way the Singapore market developed. For example, the last slide, Spring, an organization called Spring, that is deciphered there, which is an organization to help develop their futures. And it supports about 500 projects. And these projects are viewed as future economy of Singapore, which would be in Singapore several years from now. And there are officials, representative of ministries and agencies sitting on board of directors. Government is there, and I've been asking many times, how come that, like, the agencies sit on the board? They teach business people to start developing this. This is a new system of government in Singapore. I don't know whether Russia would adapt that kind of experiences. I'm more confident about investing in infrastructure. I believe in deregulation because any authority could be used against the business which is supposed to regulate and seemingly to support. And I believe in the pragmatic approach, which is actually practiced in Singapore and in China. And a very good example of such an approach where the principles of division, for example, in Russia, between the federal, regional, and municipalities is more important than the speed and attractiveness of an investment project. Because in many cases, you need to bring together all those authorities and make sure that an investor has all the support possible. And this is what we are trying to do now, to tap foreign direct investments. Безусловно, государство является важнейшим игроком для того, чтобы поддержать инновации и развитие. И мы сейчас переходим к презентации нашего коллеги. О чем вы хотите нам рассказать, Фабиан Вонг? Вы не против, если я перейду вот туда? Потому что сейчас происходит? Имеется некий разрыв между движениями наших рук и презентацией, которая у нас на экране. Не против, если я перейду непосредственно к экрану и сделаю свою презентацию оттуда?
Русский на первом, вы перепутались.
Opportunity to join the plenary session this morning. You heard the Prime Minister, and you did also hear Premier Lee. What I got from the two gentlemen, the Chinese side was these 4 words, and they used very eloquent idioms here. The China Premier used these 4 words. I'll try to repeat that, and maybe you can help me interpret that. He said, quote, 以长补短. You can try to pronounce it. It means you use your strength to cover your weakness. And then we heard a nice quote from the Prime Minister. He said, one idea plus another idea gives you more ideas. I wanted to start my presentation with these 2 quotes because I think they are talking about the same thing. And at the same time, it tells a little bit about the Asian story. And the Asian story is very simple. There are many ones, there are many pluses, there are many longs, and there are many shorts, but it adds up to a very vibrant market. I'm from Singapore, just like Mr. Yo over there. So no one calls, I'm from ASEAN, right? In Asia. It is made out of many, many, many different countries and many different cultures. But the good thing is, in 2014, it was a good year. It was a fantastic year. And 2 weeks ago, EY just released the IPO results globally, our analysis on Asia Pac and the rest of the globe. And with your permission today, I hope to share with you a little bit of the insights. All right? Let's see if this works, because this morning it didn't work for a few people. All right. Global IPO market, fantastic results. What about Asia Pacific? Let me just draw that out to you. Asia Pacific is actually top in terms of the number of deals and the value of deals. This is a good year compared to 2013, 12, and 11. Fantastic results. In Asia Pacific alone, 339 deals were made, 47.4 billion raised. The countries that did fantastically well here, brilliantly, China, Australia, Japan, India. And I'll share with you the key trends. It had more IPOs than any other regions that we saw. The top sectors, and I guess everyone is quite interested about this, top sectors, consumer staples, technology, energy are the most active sectors. But if you look at Australia, if you just put that into the Asia-Pac, context, Australia actually moved away from resources and focused more on healthcare. Interesting fact. And the third point you can see here as well is that multiple markets continue to have fantastic exits, and most of them are PE-backed exits, and many as well in cross-border listings. And this is some facts for you in terms of the top 5 exchanges and the funds raised. I've shared with you the 6 sectors, but what I wanted to share with you, this unique thing over here, the 16.4%, in terms of the first day average return, just think about that. Companies that went from startup all the way to IPO, an average of 16.4% first day average return. This is a brilliant result as well. And a few observations, which I wrote down, late last night to share with you guys. I think there is steady progress by Japan. There was one of the largest listings by Japan Display. Anyone here heard about Japan Display? Do you know what is Japan Display? It is a very, very unique proposition here. And my mentor, personal mentor, was involved in this. So I can share with you. It's not confidential information. And I feel like I'm competing with that guy next door. I'm going to do my best. So Japan Display is a very interesting listing because it is made out by Sony, 10%, Hitachi, 10%, Toshiba, 10%, and guess where that remaining 70% came from? Make a guess. Government. 30% by the largest tech or conglomerates that you see in Japan, and 70% by government. And this is one of the largest IPO listings that you have seen. We have seen, actually, personally, I've lived in Japan for 10 years. And I've seen this listing, and I thought, wow, this actually is something that it was all over the papers. And my mentor actually had a fantastic job last year. He was actually moved across to a government agency, highly independent, and the funds that were gathered there is made out by the trading houses, the Mitsubishi, the Toshiba, Hitachi, Mitsui. All these companies chipped in with government funding, and what they are trying to do is to look at innovative companies to invest in. So I think Japan, with Abenomics, with his vision for Japan in the future, I would say that it is steady progress for Japan. Australia, as I mentioned to you guys, minerals, resources, that's fantastic, but moving ahead, healthcare is top of the line. Southeast Asia, as I described, hot domestic and cross-border activity. And I think in previous sessions, we have heard that Q4 is going to be a fantastic year. Last but not least, I'd like to share with you from Hong Kong and China.
Excuse me, Mr. Wong.
Yep.
Hong Kong and mainland of China.
And mainland of China.
Yes, please.
Yes, mainland of China. The IPO candidates, fantastic. 626 potential candidates are now in the pipeline. So it is going to be a very busy year for many folks here in the room. All right, so that is my short session here. I hope to see more 以长补短. You can try pronouncing it. 以长补短. And then the 1+1, I think in this formula, in Asia-Pac, it could be more than 2. It could be a multiplier effect here. So thank you very much for your attention. I'll move back to my seat.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Wong. Thank you very much. Yeah. Well, speaking of IPO, it's sort of the purpose of the PE investors. So maybe, do you remember them? Just the Chinese company, the internet company Alibaba. had done a very successful IPO in the United States. So my Chinese peer can make some opinion or comments on this.
About Alibaba's IPO?
Yeah.
Okay. Wow. Well, it's a hard question. I think first of all, I think I have to clarify that because all my knowledge is all about the TMT sectors. So I think if we consider other sectors like real properties, so probably the different stories. I think in general I agree with all the speaker what said before, but if we focus on TMT, I do think that the story different. For example, the government funding is really helpful for the TMT sector startups. I doubt, especially in China. Also for the cross-border investment in the TMT market in Asia, I also doubt because haven't seen that much of a cross-border investment into the TMT market right now in China, because I think in Asia. So I think that's my general thought on that. But it's back to the Alibaba market, Alibaba IPO. I think probably we can talk about lots of things, but what I want to talk about probably today is I think it's really a huge encouragement for the Chinese TMT and startups. I think that before, for Chinese startups, we really focus on China because the Chinese market is huge. But now, because of mobile internet, because the new trend, for example, like the wearable devices, the new era of the hardware manufacture industry, I think Alibaba gave us a very good example for Chinese startups. We cannot focus on China. We have to focus on, and we have the opportunities to be kind of lead in the global market. So we see more and more startups, they going global. The companies founded in China, but now they kind of give up the Chinese market. They really focus on the global market because global market is easy to have the cash flow, but the TMT market, especially the internet market, is kind of a free market. Everybody go for free service, not really for money. So I think Alibaba is a huge encouragement. We have lots of opportunity in the global market. So yeah.
Speaking of IPO, because how to maximize the benefits and exit for the investors is a very important thing for the investment policy. So is it?
Can I add a bit on Alibaba as well?
Yes, please.
Because interestingly, for Alibaba, you guys will know that Alibaba is owned, a portion of Alibaba is owned by two very famous companies, right? One is Yahoo, and the other is SoftBank.
Japanese company.
Yes, and I happened in my previous career to work for these two firms. And I think, for the US listing, I personally, this is personal thinking here, is that I think that the shareholders did have a bit of a input into into that line, into Jack Ma's thinking, that, the US market would really give him that kind of return and that kind of liquidity.
But he used to do the IPO in Hong Kong, and he was rejected. Right?
Yes. So I said personally, I think that there is also some, backwater around there. So that's my 2 cents on it.
Professor Young, do you have any addition?
Well, all I know about the Alibaba IPO is all the big money that's being made by Jack Ma. But I would like to respond to an earlier comment, I think, by the minister that says, I think it may not have come up clear in what I presented, is that I believe that although the government has a role, its role must be contained. That is, it must not interfere with investment decisions. So the role of the government in stimulating, for example, seed capital and early stage capital is to incentivize and to catalyze, but not to get involved. And I think that is a very important point, which sometimes government officials, because of their enthusiasm and they think it is a sexy thing to try and become a venture capitalist, gets too much involved, and I think it is bad for the system. So for example, when I was instituting the early stage venture fund, I made it clear that we would evaluate the VC that applies for this based on an interview, based on their track record, based on what we think, whether they could do the job. And after that, the matching money goes to them and the government stays out of this. That is, they make the decisions, of course, with certain conditions that the companies must be operating in Singapore and so on. And that's it. And then, we leave it to them to do the same thing. I think this is an important principle because as a result of some of the programs that we instituted, it was able to draw out a lot of people who would otherwise invest in real estate, they would speculate the stock market. There are a lot of high net worth people in Singapore. They've made some money from whatever, and they would like to invest. But because of the high risk, they didn't want to go into startups. So the government's role in such a situation is to lower the risk by co-investing a large part of the money, so that if the startup succeeds, the investor gains. If the startup dies, which is very often, the investor loses only a small part, not 100%, but maybe 15%, 20%, right? So that makes the risk appetite, then that makes them more inclined to try to do that. And in addition, in the scheme that was done, the government also limits its gains. So for instance, by co-funding for the early stage venture funds, they have got 20 million to invest, right? And at the end of the investment period, 5 years, they could decide that they've invested in some very good companies, and therefore they could give back the 10 million to Singapore government, to the National Research Foundation, and then keep all the upside. So it's a very good incentive for them to come in. So I think the point I'm trying to make is that the schemes must be well designed so that it aligns the interests of the parties concerned, so that you can stimulate a lot of private money. I think the point is that it should be private sector driven, private money, but with a lower risk, so that they are willing to do the investments.
Thank you, Professor Yuan. And may I ask you, Mr. Karpovich, do you think the IPO is the most efficient exit or the only exit for the PE investors?
Well, it's not the only one, obviously, but it provides certain liquidity for early investors and allows also to incentivize the management and the employees properly. I think we've seen a number of examples of companies going public, and Alibaba, I think, is just the latest big example of a company that's become successful, and I'm sure we'll see kind of the further iterations of that as the proceeds get plowed back into the economy, and I think there's only so much can be invested in the domestic market, so I think some of that will flow to other markets. But also, I think the M&A market is also a fairly efficient way to monetize early stage investments, and there's a fair amount of M&A activity, and IPOs just supplement that. So that's at least what we've seen in the venture capital space, that when investors come into any deal, obviously they always think about, okay, what's my time horizon and how I'm going to need to capitalize and monetize my investment, and the two traditional ways to do that would be through an IPO or through a trade sale. interestingly enough, obviously China is a huge market, but what we see in the Russian market as well is that a lot of companies and entrepreneurs from the get-go start to think about, okay, how do I build a global company, not just a domestic company, but how do I build a global company? And that's why from the early stages, entrepreneurs are building companies that would appeal to global markets, that would appeal to international investors, and that would be able to go cross-border. And I think that's a very important aspect of it.
And do you think the Russian stock market have enough space for his own startups and high-tech companies?
You ask me?
Yes, please.
Well, there is a Russian stock market, obviously, but what we also see is that some companies and investors encourage companies to think globally, and there's a choice. You know, if you can take a company public in Russia, yes, you certainly should be able to do that. But because of sometimes international investors and companies becoming global, they go to other exchanges. So I think choosing an exchange and where to go public, I think it's an individual choice for any company, and they have to make it accordingly. But at the end of the day, investors should have a choice, and companies should have a choice. So.
Might go to our experts, Mr. Gopka. You used to run big funds in Russia. So what's your opinion and your experience?
Thank you so much. So yeah, I would like to thank for the presentation, especially Professor Euro on this. This is the topic which really is of interest to me, how we could develop venture industry in Russia. I was managing a $500 million fund, which was funded 100% by Rosnano, but we were a private group managing this fund, so it was a very different structure, where Rosnano take part in the decision-making process, but the motivation of the team and myself was very straightforward, very like private-driven, with the same structure, with carried interest and interest in the success. So, and with much less involvement of Rosnano. However, generally speaking, the approach is very different, and the approach is that the government is involved normally, very much, which is, to me, I believe that it may be appropriate, but when it's 10 billion under management, then it's already funds of funds, and you cannot really manage each investment. So, and the funds, RVC and Rosnano, these are really like large investors. So they could be like funds of funds. The question which I have like a couple of questions, but one question which to Igor and to Mr. Igor as well. Just wondering, this I didn't hear in your presentation, and Igor mentioned that one of the ideas is that we have to be open to invest outside Russia, because as you said, success breeds success. To have this kind of experience, understanding, and we, by the way, the fund which I manage, we invested only into the U.S. and all the investments we made. It was a partnership with the largest venture fund in the U.S., Domain Associates. And we, by the way, there were not many, but they were Chinese co-investors as well, very professional. We, in my view, as like managers, we gain a lot of experience, obviously, and we have now the vision of like invisibility into the companies which are competitive worldwide. And now when we approach Russian opportunities, we already have this bar, very high bar, but we're trying to find the same things which can be competitive in the global market, and we have now the eye to understand that. So my question to Igor, if you're working, I understand it's Burbank, and whether you are considering at all, since it's government money, generally speaking, and government-controlled bank, do you consider investments outside Russia, and how do you manage this issue of, and of course, And then the second question goes to Maxim, to Mr. Shereykin on the how you manage as well this issue when you are always accused of selling Russia, as you said in your story. So how do you manage that you can and should invest outside Russia at some point to have this visibility and competitiveness as a fund or as a fund manager, and then how you manage this issue of like attracting FDI and selling some of the Russian companies, Russian plants, and how do you answer that issues and accusations? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Just to clarify, I run our venture banking business, which we're developing together with our partners from the Silicon Valley Bank, who were on the panel prior to us. Our business is actually to provide banking and financing, as in debt financing, for high technology, innovation-driven companies, which I think is a very important topic in Russia today and globally, as a matter of fact. And we've seen examples of that being done very well in Silicon Valley, in Singapore and other parts of the world. So we are not an investor, right? But we help bank and finance high technology companies to enable them to become more successful. But in doing that, we work very closely with venture capital funds in Russia and global venture capital funds who are investors, but we view them as partners because they invest in companies and we enable those companies to become more successful, which also involves creation of the ecosystem, right? And we are building the ecosystem in Russia. Today, for example, we have elements of that. We have Skolkovo, we have RVC, we have Rusnano, we have other initiatives, we have lawyers and accountants, advisors, etc. And we have now the banking sector that's kind of pulling it all together. So just wanted to clarify. But the question that you're asking, yeah, we want our companies to be successful and we want them to become global.
But then my question is then, I know Silicon Valley Bank very well. I'm sitting at the board of several companies where they got the funding from Silicon Valley Bank. And I was interviewed by Silicon Valley Bank because they checking, making diligence as a board member. And but then is not a Russian market too narrow then for Sberbank, or is it really that enough clients, I would say, for you here in Russia?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's in its infancy, but if you go to any of the conference, just last Friday we had a conference, Silicon Valley Meets Russia. We had probably in excess of 600 registrations. It's startups, entrepreneurs, etc. If you go to the TechCrunch, you go to Demo Day, you go to Startup Village, for example, that happens in June, you'll see probably close to 1,000 companies there. So there's a lot of entrepreneurial activity in Russia, and we think that the market is deep enough. According to RVC estimates, there is probably about $8 billion of under management in Russia alone in venture capital funds. So there's a deep enough market, and it's going to go up. So we are very, very bullish on that. So, of course, in the grand scheme, it's only a portion of our business, right? And but we think it's going to grow. And if you think about the technology sector, it generally exhibits higher rates of growth than other sectors of the economy. It's the sector that's needed very much in Russia and in other parts of the world, right? And that's why we're big supporters of working with high technology companies, of helping them become more successful. And if you know the Silicon Valley Bank, you know their business model, you know it's successful, it works, and we're going to see that model work in Russia as well.
And Susie, Mr. Cochard would like to add some comments on this.
Thank you. Just to underline again that in Asia Pacific, I mean, we have this, all of us have this idea, this kind of benchmark in mind about the Silicon Valley success story of the startup who goes at the end of the road to the IPO. This model does not really function in Asia Pacific so far. I mean, we can discuss the technicalities. We can discuss which kind of companies are actually listed in Asia Pacific currently. If Alibaba went to the United States, I mean, it is a little bit the same old story that actually the local markets are not deep enough, and that, I mean, finance in Asia is still provided by banks and not by financial markets, etc. This model is still not functioning. And when I was mentioning that actually government action is needed, it's not because it's the best way, it's because we do not currently have a better choice in Asia Pacific. The big story of the current, of the century actually will be, and we could have spoken about it today, it will be the renminbi internationalization. It's an ongoing process, but this definitely will change this age, the face of Asian finance and the way actually startup will be financed in Asia Pacific. It's not only a global macroeconomic issue, it's not only a political issue. Basically, currently, cross-border finance in Asia is based on US dollars. Let's say there is currently in circulation in Asia Pacific $1 trillion US dollars, which make the finance there. If there is a full currency liberalization of the renminbi, it will be multiplied by 20, basically for financing economy and startups in Asia Pacific. This will actually totally change the way it works. And then we will have this ideal scenario, Silicon Valley type of companies being built and going to the IPO and meeting actually a deep reservoir of investors. But currently it does not exist, and we have to address it.
Thank you. And according to the...
I had a question to Mr. Shereykin as well.
Okay.
But before, I want to praise you for I understand you were involved in Kaluga region, and we invested into Kaluga region. We started a plant there, plant construction. It was very competitive. We chose out of many regions, and we like Kaluga very well. And I hope that you will have the same success in the Far East. But how do you manage this accusation of you selling Russia to the international investor?
Я буду краток.
I'll be brief. Investors were offered a product and they bought it. An opportunity to open very quickly with minimum risks to open up their business in the regions. And the velocity of entry into the market, a lack of risk, was much better than in many other neighboring regions. It was very simple, and we kept on saying that foreign investors hired local talents, and the best people in those companies are Russian top managers, and it is a mutual development. It is not seldom that a Russian company, a Russian factory is much better in terms of competition as far as Brazil or China or in Germany. So it's not very clear who wins over whom. So this is a live dialogue, and investors in Kaluga realized that you need to be multicultural. Well, many people say that we are very much similar, but we are different, and you need to actually understand that. And multiculturalism is actually what is happening in Kaluga. We support investors, and we believe that the entry of major investors into the local market stimulate the local development, and, for example, many local companies are now flourishing. In the Far East, the situation is different. We have efficient neighbors, and I don't believe that we need to be afraid of our strong neighbors. It's very difficult to outwit our China partners. You need to cooperate with them, you need to work together, and to be brief about what we are doing, for example, our Prime Minister is please integrate into the Asia. You need to go this way. You need to plant a tree to get fruits.
So one of them is China, efficient, right? It's a very unique comment. Thank you. Should I say thank you? Okay. According our limited time, so I have to turn our topic to our expert, Mr. Falaleev. He would like to share us with his presentation.
Thank you very much. As I got presentation, sorry it's in Russian, so if possible, I would like to be very fast and very exact. So is it possible if I start in Russian? because I would like to describe some trends, and I see everybody have translation devices.
Yeah, it's
Is it okay for
okay.
you?
It's okay. It's okay, please.
Я секундочку, так я уже все.
I see that everyone is a bit tired. I'd like to be very brief, and I'd like to talk about the venture capital market results of 2014 about trends. We did a bit of a study, which is a study dedicated to 14 to this year. Part of our investigation will be based on the results of 11 months of this year. I'm not ready to share with you these preliminary results, but they are very interesting. And I do believe that in about 1.5 months, we might be having a better picture of the trends in this area. I will go through very quickly through my presentation. We have some positives, factors, and we have something which is very difficult, very hard to analyze. We see that the market has a downward trend, and all our studies indicate this direction. It's not that negative, but you need to interpret it in the proper way. It's a funnel where part of the investors made a decision to leave Russia, and you could see it on a massive scale. And there is nothing to be afraid of. Our international investors not need to be afraid. Another negative trend is that foreign investors became very calm, to say the least, especially the European foundations and American funds. As far as major deals are concerned, we have one example there. They are in favor of syndicates. There are not that many trends of this kind. Even Tiger didn't go that far. This is a major foundation. Out of these are some of the examples, but the trend, downward trend, is there. The market is growing, and it is mostly the government which contributes to this growth, and this is a positive trend, irrespective of where the money comes from. The positive trends include the reason that global funds, global investors leave Russian market opens up a niche for potential Asian investors, and this is a good thing because we welcome good companies, and this is good news for international investors which are not afraid to come to the Russian market. So you might make a conclusion like this. Another trend which we view as a positive is a growth in middle-sized or small-sized deals. And there are not that many of them, but the positive trend is that they at long last are visible. Irrespective of what is happening now on the political scale and things like that, the number of such deals is growing. And there are some figures which our speaker presents here. They are not that well. And one of the deals, again, has a better impact on that. In the context of our discussion here is that Russian funds, out of 10 funds, top 10, starts looking elsewhere, overseas, abroad, and they go into syndicates with global investors. and some other major players. Lots of deals in Israel. Some major private funds see some of the opportunities in Singapore. I personally know that some of the funds are trying to look elsewhere. For example, a major player, Mr. Sergey Belarusov, who I view as a Sherp between Russia and Singapore. China is also a good opportunity. I do believe that China angle could be very good, a positive trend. Briefly, there are private funds which are being established, strange though it is, but the trend is there. I do believe that the situation in the capital market is not that bad, irrespective of the figures you could see. I do believe that there'll be new players emerging, and these are very good companies. This is my vision, my view of the situation. And a number of figures, major ones. I'm not going to repeat all of them. You could clearly see them in both Russian and English, which provides you with a market segmentation. There are several major deals, over $100 million worth. It's not that bad. I do believe that these figures are a good indication that towards the end of the year, the market is going up slightly bit.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Padalev. And thank you all our speakers and experts share with us their experience and ideas today. I hope all of you have benefits from our discussion. And at the end, let me wish all of us have a more efficient future in the capital markets and startups and anywhere. Thank you. Thanks again. Thank you, our experts. Thank you.